Hello, Tony.
Hey, Joris.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you. And thank you for coming over to our podcast on Snowflake's ecosystem.
Oh, it's great. You're welcome. Thank you for having us. Very happy to take part.
Tony, you're with Fivetran, and Fivetran is this really dominant player in the Snowflake ecosystem for as long as I can remember. And we've been doing Snowflake since 2016, 2017. What business problem does Fivetran actually solve?
Well, I suppose the biggest problem in the industry would be getting access to data. So, if I was to ask you on any analytics project that you're working on, what's the major challenge you have? It's getting access to that data. Data is often siloed in many different systems in the organization, and typically that's unrealized value. Organizations don't realize the value of the data that sits there. They typically concentrate on modern SaaS-based applications, but often the real valuable information lies somewhere inside in the organization and legacy platforms. So really, to answer your question again, the biggest challenge facing organizations is getting access to that data.
Yeah, it's something we see in our projects as well. So what we saw in the past definitely was that if we need access to data, that we go pick it up dataset by dataset. It's a very labor-intensive process to set that up, to investigate it, but also to maintain it. And problem is, you have to do it all over again if you move on to a new project or a new customer.
Yeah, pretty much so. So you've mentioned a couple of things there. First off, in terms of, having to get consistent data, pipelines breaking, having to go reinvent pipelines when you move from one project to the next. Quite a few things you've mentioned there that certainly Fivetran is a tool that could help you with all of those challenges. So firstly, when it comes to actual, getting robust pipelines, we have over 200 connectors now available for a broad range of types of connections. So we usually categorize them into 3 or 4 different categories. So we've got a typical SaaS-based connectors where we get data from Salesforce and Google Analytics and so on, all of these SaaS-based sales and marketing tools. The next category of connectors that we have out of the box is file connectors. So we can connect to a broad range of file sources as well, and they could be, SFTP locations on an on-premise server. It could be Google Drive or an S3 bucket, many different storage locations where we support file imports. The next category of connectors we would support is webhooks. So, things like Kafka, where we can pick up and interact with messages that your clients' customers, as they're engaging on websites, we can trap those engagements and capture them too. And then more recently, the database type category of connectors. So we also now support connection to on-premise databases. So, traditional databases like IBM DB2 and Oracle and SAP and SQL Server and so on. So I think it's that broad range of support for many, many different connectors that are available out of the box, often with just a single click. So if you want to connect to a Salesforce instance, you just provide the authentication, the credentials to log in, single click, you choose the data you want to sync, and that's it. Fivetran manages everything else in the background. We manage the initial historical bulk load of all that data from your Salesforce instance. Once that initial historical load is completed, we then kick off an incremental sync with live updates occurring, with a guaranteed 5-minute sync interval, as low as a 5-minute sync interval. That goes down to a guaranteed 1-minute sync interval for database connectors, but for the SaaS-based connectors, it's usually 5-minute guaranteed sync. So back to your point about, pipelines breaking, having to rebuild them and the maintenance of all of those. These are all zero code, zero maintenance connectors that we provide. We provide the coding on it. If, most software vendors regularly change their API sets, so Salesforce would launch a new API. We're proactive with that. We would have that API built and ready and rolled out before the new API is even launched. So you don't need to worry about that maintenance side of it.
And I think that's the real value that we see ourselves when we use Fivetran in projects. So that especially in the first category of connectors, your SaaS connectors, you guys really deliver an SLA on a data source connection. And that's super important to us because actually, we're a consulting company. Our bread and butter used to be moving data from source A into source B and transforming it. But at scale, we cannot manage it. We really need a party that can pick up an SLA for us. They need to make sure that every 5 minutes, every time something new is entered in a source system, that data becomes available in Snowflake. And if something goes wrong, we basically want a support mail address. And especially in the first category of connectors, that is what we get from Fivetran. And what I specifically like as well is that you guys managed to maintain a more or less standardized and documented data model for all of the sources that you synchronize. It's a huge time saver for us, actually.
Yeah, I mean, so you've mentioned a couple of really interesting points. You're right. We take the burden away from you in terms of development and maintenance. We also take it away in terms of documentation. So we've got over 250 engineers who are first of all, maintaining your pipeline, making sure that your data is where it needs to be, when it needs to be. Like we've got a 99.97% platform uptime, which is an incredibly reliable uptime. We've also got a team, documentation team, who are continually updating the documentations whenever API sets change. As I said, our engineers are updating the API code, and at the same time, the documentation team is updating those ERDs. There's one other interesting point you mentioned there, which is very relevant in terms of what Fivetran's approach to business too. You said that, as a consulting firm, you're changing from traditionally being involved in data movement projects, or moving data from one place to another, to actually, looking more at the data analytics themselves, where the data lands. That's a key differentiator for Fivetran. It's one of the big differences in our approach. Without Fivetran, typically if you're building a proof of concept for a client, you're looking at maybe 4 to 5 weeks of just trying to get access to the data out of your 6-week proof of concept. So you're limiting the amount of time that you have to deliver value in the proof of concept, because you don't have the time to build out those AI dashboards and analytics, because you're just wasting so much time on data access.
If you manage to deliver even 6 weeks, 6 weeks is not too much if you have to do all of these infrastructural things yourself.
So there's a statistic that says 87% of AI projects fail, that don't ever make it into production.
And it's not about the algorithm, it's about the availability of data and making sure the right data is in at the right data quality. And if it's not, at least.
Yeah, so not only are you spending weeks trying to get access to data, but usually in a proof of concept, you're working with a sample of data too, an extract of data, not with the actual production data. So with Fivetran, a proof of concept looks completely different. We have this term called reducing the time to live. So literally from week 1, when you plug Fivetran in, you get access to the data, and you get access to all the historical set of data for your proof of concept, not just the sample extract. So obviously real benefits to that are from week 1, you actually have data, so you can actually start delivering value to the stakeholders in the proof of concept. So you've got 5 to 6 weeks to deliver value. But also because we're syncing the entire data set from day 1, the transition from proof of concept into production is just an extension of the proof of concept. It's not a complete rewrite like it usually is, where you don't have access to that data.
And it allows companies like ours to start talking business language from day 1. And we don't have to explain that we need to set up servers, that we need to do network things. Basically, we can talk about what is this project going to bring you in terms of ROI. And also, if you look at it, and maybe I'm a bit blunt here, Tony, but from the project point of view, there's very low value added in moving data from A to B. So it is something that can be automated, can be outsourced to parties that can just be far more efficient than us, and even us on a project base. And that could be Fivetran. And it was great when we started out with Salesforce, because that's the connector we use most. And then we used a few digital native data connectors as well. But moving into the enterprise space, SaaS is usually not the default deployment method. Many companies still reside on mainframes, they reside on DB2s, they reside on Oracle servers. Data that lives on-prem in a data center, tucked away behind firewalls, and it was a very tough process for us to get that data over to Snowflake. There was technology in the past that could do that, but technology that typically took a bit of maintenance, so typical CDC technology. But we noticed recently that Fivetran made a quite a big acquisition, namely the HVR acquisition. And HVR seems to be a technology that takes data from on-prem sources into Snowflake, and without the overheads. What's your take on that? And how do you see that fit?
Yeah, so you're correct. Traditionally, when Fivetran started, we were focused mainly on SaaS-based applications. So we are the industry leader in migrating data from SaaS-based applications to data warehouses. We also had database connectors too. So we were always able to connect to SQL Server and Oracle and other databases on-prem as well. But to be honest, it wasn't very efficient. We weren't as good as we needed to be in that space. In 2021, we acquired a company called HVR. HVR is the industry leader in high volume database replication. And over the last 12 months or so, we've been busy merging the two technologies. So we've taken the best of Fivetran SaaS-based application with all of the benefits like 99.97 uptime and the resilience that's there. And we've also taken the best from the HVR technology and combined that with the Fivetran cloud-based technology. So what we have now is we have what we call our high volume agent database connectors, or HVA, Fivetran HVA. So what was traditionally HVR is now Fivetran HVA. And the way it works is we've taken the high volume agent portion from HVR. This is a small, lightweight piece of software that sits on the server where the database is located. So it connects directly to the databases. It uses the database transaction logs for its updates once that initial historical sync is completed. So once we finish the initial sync, we're not actually touching the production database for getting the live updates. We're only accessing the database transaction logs. So there's a couple of real benefits of using the high volume agent. The first one is obviously we're not affecting the production environment. So there's no downtime or no impact on production latency. The second big benefit is using the agent allows us to both encrypt and also compress the data at source. So before it even leaves the on-prem location to get to the cloud, it's already compressed and encrypted. Using that compression, again, we're minimizing the amount of data we're transmitting. In other words, minimizing that latency again. So database transaction logs, we're only taking the data that changes, not the entire data set each time. And then compressing that data again also really does minimize the amount of data we need to sync to the data warehouse. Another big benefit that's often overlooked for the high volume agents is what's called a distributed architecture. So using the agent allows for a truly distributed architecture. So if you've got a large corporate client who perhaps may have multiple database servers, even in different physical locations, you can install the agent on each one of those servers and it will transfer the data up to the cloud and spread the load across the different locations.
You touched a very interesting point over there, Tony. One that we feel like is very important in the projects that we do, at least, and that is database replication and the CDC, transaction log replication, as you call it. It's pretty technical, but the way we see it is that we actually make double use of a mechanism that any on-prem database has to make sure that when the machine goes down, the database and the data inside, they're not lost. So we are taking basically the ledger of every change on that database, and we're making copies from one database technology into another. And yeah,
this is an almost near real-time sync. So there's a couple of issues that affect it due to latency, and that's due to the infrastructure in the on-prem location, what kind of infrastructure is in place. But it's usually down to as low as a 1 minute guaranteed sync frequency, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and it's hyper fast, and it comes with a few added benefits for companies for the type of projects we do. And because typically, or for more often than we want to see, is that applications are not designed to retain history, especially if you work in larger deployments, say factories or operational systems. They typically throw away data after 3 days, and everything as of the 4th day is lost. If we can work with database replication the way HVR offers, we get a notification that something is deleted. And we can capture that information and we can store the fact that something is deleted in our own analytical systems. And that is of huge value in many operational processes. In terms of analytics, you actually want to know that something is deleted. And another benefit that we see in this context is the fact that, and sorry to be very blunt again here, is that Fivetran or HVR, CDC technology, basically just takes a bulk copy of data without really knowing what that data is or means, just taking it from point A and moving it over to point B, leaving it over there, make sure it fits into the database technology of choice, and Snowflake in our case, and start picking up new data. In projects, we often get the argument that business teams who need to access business data and operational systems, they need to be aware of how to access those systems. Typically, they don't get access to those systems. There are access rules in place. They have to know the source systems, the data structures are not easy to understand. And actually, we're bypassing that sort of argument. So business users no longer need access to those systems, but they find the structures they know and rely on for years in a new database, such as Snowflake. And that's a huge shift in how teams work. Do you see the same?
Yeah, getting access to data, we said at the very start, is the biggest challenge facing these organizations. For obvious reasons, large corporate clients are very protective of their internal legacy databases, their ERP systems. They need to be protected. You cannot open up those systems to everybody in the organization. So those systems don't have the mechanism in place to be able to share the data. So getting it synced to a data warehouse and having that data then available to the entire organization, that getting access to data really is, I see, where our focus will be again in 2023.
Yeah. You touched on legacy and you touched on large organizations. When we work with them, say governments, global manufacturing companies, we see a host of those legacy systems on-prem, of course. We are in the business for, say, 15 years at max. Sometimes we encounter documentation of source systems that hasn't been updated since, say, the year 2000. So really, really legacy systems. And then customers ask us, hey, can you free this data and can you build like a modern analytics process on top of this? And then we have to start thinking about, what is this system? How do we get access to this system? What did it mean more or less 30 years ago to have this sort of data structure? And frankly, we could investigate, we could deliver on that, but it wouldn't be efficient, not cost efficient at all. And if things break, we would be responsible. And frankly, we have many things to do, and fixing breaks from 30 years ago isn't where we are going to bring our most value at. So what I especially like is that companies like HVR, they offer a very high degree of expertise in making sure those connectors work. It seems like you guys see every kind of edge case on every type of database that we might have heard of, but actually basically have never worked in. Is that something that is of importance? So this service desk and then the level of quality for these service desks for both HVR, so the database replication component, as well as the SaaS component?
Yeah, so I mean, we're in the business of providing real-time data syncs from on-prem or cloud-based applications to data warehouse. That's what we do. We ingest data. In order for us to maintain that 99.97% platform uptime, we have to have robust pipelines. So these connectors that we build are extensively tested before they go out. When they go out, they go into a private preview first, where we have a few select clients that test them. Then they move from private preview to beta, where we get a wider audience testing them. And then only then, when it's been fully tested, do we roll it out into general availability. So it goes through, every single connector we build goes through an extensive test process. Once it's live, then we have very robust recovery failover points built into every single connector that runs. So the way we manage recovery is Fivetran will always save the last successful state of the sync in a cursor. So, for example, if we're syncing data from a SaaS-based application or indeed a legacy database system, we'll save the last successful sync date. And if the connection breaks for some reason, it might be due to an API outage, or it could be due to a database connection issue. We save the last point. So when the connection becomes available again, we pick up at that point and we continue it on. It doesn't break. We guarantee the data consistency. You don't have to go back and resync the entire historical set just because there's been a break in the connection. We manage that using cursors and save state points as well.
Yeah, I'll try to rephrase because I think this is important. So when we do zero to cloud projects, so customers who live in an on-prem situation and they just start out with cloud projects, they might have new Azure accounts, new AWS accounts, but they live by themselves on an island. And often there is no high SLA type of connection line between the on-prem data center and the cloud data center. What you just explained, does it mean that in absence of that sort of high quality, high SLA connection, if the slower commonly available connections with lower SLAs, if they temporarily break or are not available, Fivetran will cover that?
We will save the last successful state point. So one other point that's relevant to that scenario you just described, where it's a very slow connector, legacy on-prem, where we can't guarantee the connection. We also use staging buckets when we're transferring the data. If we have a high availability connection, usually it lands in the destination like immediately, or depending on latency, within a minute or two, it gets landed to the destination. We then delete the data. We never store the data on our infrastructure after it's landed in the data warehouse. However, the scenario you just pointed, where the connection is slow, in that case, we have to buffer the data and store it somewhere like in an S3 bucket on our infrastructure while we're caching it. So we're going to build it up in chunks from the source to this bucket, and then when we have a sufficient amount of data that we can sync to the warehouse, we'll send it to the warehouse. So we're constantly managing that caching and buffering, as well as using cursor points to flag when the most successful sync date occurred. In the case of data that's stored on our infrastructure, like that buffer that I'm talking about, we guarantee that we delete it once it's landed to the warehouse. And separately, we also have an SLA undertaking where we will delete it anyway, even if it doesn't land in the warehouse, if it's on our infrastructure for 24 hours.
Yeah. So does it mean that both in the scenario where we would be replicating SaaS sources, as well as in the scenario where we would be replicating on-prem sources through HVR, data is all going over Fivetran's central infrastructure, temporarily being stored there, being buffered there, being prepared actually to load into Snowflake, and then moving it over to Snowflake and then deleting it?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily stored on Fivetran infrastructure, except in that situation you mentioned, where it's a low SLA, very slow connection, and we have no choice but to cache it and buffer it into our location.
Okay. Yeah, and storing. If it's stored, does it move over Fivetran's infrastructure? Just out of interest, is data taken from on-prem to Fivetran's infrastructure to Snowflake? Or okay, yeah.
But bear in mind, it is encrypted at source. So before it even leaves the client's destination, it's encrypted when it's going through the Fivetran infrastructure. So from Fivetran's perspective, we never have visibility of the data. We cannot see client data at any point from when it's picked up on the source. It's encrypted. And when it lands in the destination data warehouse, it gets decrypted there. We don't have access to the data warehouses, so we can't see the data there either. In certain rare circumstances, if a client wants us to look at the data to troubleshoot some issue, if they're having a problem, we have a very strict protocol in place as to how we do that. A request has to be made to the relevant channels at the client and at Fivetran, signed off at a management level before our support team gets access to that data. And it's only for that one-time incident investigation. Once that's concluded, that access is removed again.
Yeah, and basically that takes us to a topic that is close to my heart, because we feel like it's important in every project we do, and it's data privacy and data security. If you have a need to replicate high volumes of data, often they're fairly granular data sets. So including names, anything that can be covered by GDPR. So I heard the argument about encryption on-prem before data moves to Fivetran's infrastructure. But what is the global view of Fivetran on regulations such as GDPR?
Sure. So I can tell you that Fivetran has the most security certifications than any other cloud-based ELT provider. So it's something we take very seriously. We take the privacy of data very seriously. We're in many, many regions in the world, so we have to look at compliance related to specific regions and also specific industries. So, for example, we've obviously got GDPR in the EU, we've got CCPA, we've got SOC 2 compliance in the US. Specific to the US and specific to the healthcare industry in the US, we have HIPAA, which is a health insurance privacy law. So we're very conscious and very aware of different regulations and compliance obligations in different countries and in different regions. And we manage all of those. So that's the first point I'll make. We've got all of those certifications. Few other points that are valid here and relevant. When a user or a client signs up for Fivetran, they have the option of choosing two things. One is where their instance of Fivetran will run. So they can choose to run it in Azure or AWS Cloud or Google Cloud. And when they do that, they can also choose the region. So if the client is in Europe, then they can pick EU as one, like Frankfurt or one of the EU destinations, to ensure that data resides in the EU to comply with GDPR. If it's in the UK, then they can choose the UK because of Brexit. Now, UK is a separate region, so they can actually choose AWS or Azure as the provider, but choose the UK as the region instead of the EU as a region, and so on. So that's another point where they can choose both where the Fivetran instance is hosted, but also where the data gets processed. So they can host Fivetran in one region and run the data processing in another region if they choose. So we are that granular. We allow them to choose both where the Fivetran infrastructure is running and also where the data gets processed.
And that comes as a managed service, so we don't have to worry about setting up the Azure or AWS account. Fivetran has their own. It's a shared tenant model. Data moves into that tenant and then moves over to our Snow.
Exactly, yeah. And then when you get to individual cloud providers like Azure and AWS, Google, we've also got, for most of our connectors, particularly database connectors for on-prem, you can choose to have a direct connection, in which case you need to have TLS enabled on the database server with a valid certificate, or you can choose to connect via an SSH tunnel, which is a little bit more secure. But then finally, for people who want an extra layer of privacy, we also support AWS Private Link and Azure Private Link and the Google alternative. So clients, you may have clients now that are running their entire business in the cloud. They might not be on-premise anymore. It might be a legacy Oracle database, but it could be hosted at AWS or Azure on a Linux server. So those kind of clients probably have their infrastructure in the cloud provider in a private cloud, not in the public cloud. So we also support Private Link, AWS and Azure Private Link, where you can actually choose to run Fivetran and the data will not leave that client's private cloud. It'll never go to the public cloud.
Yeah, we get lots and lots and lots of questions, and rightfully so, on those topics. And the way we see it, and TLS means data is encrypted, so every byte that goes out is encrypted, but there's no like SLA on the line itself. SSH is a method to make sure that we meet basic requirements of cybersecurity teams, and by making sure that there is at least a encrypted channel where the data passes through that is then encrypted again using this TLS method. And the last method, the private link methods, is the one we get most questions from. And the way we see it, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we manage to use private link, it actually means that data never leaves the physical building, the physical data center, where both Fivetran as well as Snowflake are hosted. And so that means that a customer would manage a very secure, dedicated connection between their own on-prem data center into Azure's or AWS's. Data moves over there in a hyper-secured way. And as soon as it's in the infrastructure cloud's data center, it basically never leaves again.
Yeah.
That's a strategy that is like super popular in the.
Yeah, when you get dealing with large corporates, particularly in financial services and healthcare and stuff, where privacy is a very high level, it's important.
Yeah. Okay. It's not the easiest topic to understand, but it feels like the way we are dealing with data in 2023 is actually that direction. You no longer are basically copy-pasting sources, but you're basically designing far larger ecosystems. Companies like Fivetran, Snowflake, SaaS players who really take their focus serious and build very in-depth solutions are taking a lot of burden away from us.
Yeah, there's two quick points I'll make. One, in terms of Fivetran as a company, we started just over 10 years ago, and we've always been a cloud company. We're built for the cloud, so security is from day one has been a primary concern. But just apart from that, one of the really cool feature we have that's really really applicable on this topic is the ability to block or hash specific columns of data when you're transferring it. So, for example, you might have an application, a database application that you're migrating to Snowflake, and one of those has customer records, which has like a date of birth or a social security number or something like that, which, as you know from GDPR, is personally identifiable information. So it's pretty strict as to what you can do with that information. With Fivetran, you can choose to hash those columns. So you can hash the social security number or the date of birth, land it in the Snowflake warehouse. If that column is used, if it's an ID that's used across multiple tables and you need to join it across multiple tables, even though you hash it, you can actually maintain the join across multiple tables. So you can still search across the date of birth field or search across the social security number, but the column is hashed across all the columns, and you will not see, it will not display that information in terms of it being personally identifiable information.
So hashing, tokenization, it's in the same area, and we get lots of questions on that again as well. Does it happen on-prem? That's a big question customers ask.
The hashing happens on-prem. It happens before the data leaves the on-prem destination. Yeah. So we don't hash it in the source database. We lift it from the source database using the high volume agent, which is still on-prem, and then we hash it at that point before it gets sent to the destination. In the case of a SaaS-based application like Salesforce, then it gets hashed before it leaves the Salesforce instance.
Okay, yeah, we are in a post-Schrems 2 situation these days. So privacy regulation is very tight, and the way data is moved from contract A to contract B between parties with mother holdings in different areas of the world is people are super sensitive, and rightfully so, about that. Huh? So the way I understand this, Tony, is that you are actually tokenizing or masking or even totally encrypting, one-way encrypting data before it leaves the data center. So the data is still being processed under the contract of the company that takes a lease on the data center, right?
Correct. Yeah. So even if we don't hash columns, we're still encrypting all of the data before it leaves the source.
Yeah, yeah. And then when Fivetran moves data afterwards, typically people are far more confident that it's not private data anymore that they're moving, but it's semi-readable or just statistical formats.
Yep.
Interesting stuff, Tony. Personally, I've been a fan of Fivetran since as long as you know. I know you guys, which is, I guess, since 2017 or even before. But tell me, if you want to do a proof of concept, if you want to start a new project, how does it go about? Do you have like a sales cycle of 6 months and the way traditional on-prem companies work? Or what's the process there?
Yeah, so I suppose we do have a particular sales cycle or sales process, but it really would depend on the kind of client. So if you're talking about large enterprise clients that have high volume legacy databases, then there is a good bit of work to do. I mean, any client can sign up for a 14-day trial on Fivetran, but they don't get the benefit of what we bring to the table. If they go through the proof of concept process, it's better because they can leverage our sales engineers and our account executives to make sure that the trial is a successful trial and we get a successful.
Our experience with that is very, very positive. Like sales engineers who've been involved in the things we've done together, like super knowledgeable, especially when it comes down to those exotic data sources that we encounter once in our careers, so to say. These people are knowledgeable. I'm surprised every time that things get fixed at the pace they get fixed. So, Tony, I really want to thank you for this conversation. I've learned a lot.
In my pleasure. I've learned a lot too talking to you.